Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. My name is Ruth Bridger. I'm the VP of Marketing with Xorcom, a manufacturer of hardware solutions based on Asterisk, open source for telephony. And I'm joined by John Malone, the CEO of Eastern Management Group. This is a group that has been doing research on telephony trends for almost 3 decades now. And the way the webinar is structured, John will give us some insight based on recent research that he's conducted, specifically on open source PBX purchasing behavior versus conventional PBX. And then we'll give, from Xorcom's point of view, a look at industry trends. And then we'll leave about 15 minutes at the quarter to the hour for questions, which we invite you to submit in your chat box or your question box as we go along. And we'll try to address those questions at the end of the session. So I hand over now the controls to John.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Nice to have an opportunity this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are, to talk with you about Open Source PBX. Just a little bit of background. Eastern Management is a market research firm. We've been studying the worldwide PBX market now for more than 25 years and reporting out on it every single quarter through a program we have called Monitor. The open source area is a newer one for us. We've been looking at open source now for 2 years. And we've been looking at open source because it's been apparent to us that there's a lot of this technology in the marketplace, not just because it's free, but because it holds down the cost for the users and delivers an enormous amount of applications, putting them at the disposal of people like yourselves or your customers. The data I'm going to go through with you today, some of it does appear in a report that we published. You can learn more about it on our company website, and it focuses on open source markets. And in addition to that, I'll be sharing some information with you that we have not released to the public, and that will be from more recent interviews that we've done. If Eastern is accused of anything, it is accused of over-researching whenever we take a look at any technology. The open source market, we did a view of the market less than a year ago, interviewed over 7,000 companies to find out what they're doing in the open source area. In the beginning of October this year, we took another look at the market, our third look, not our second, but our third look at the market, and took in information after interviewing 5,000 companies. These aren't 5,000 surveys we send out and then hope for responses. These are 5,000 data points that we have. So we're very comfortable with the information that we present. Right now, we are the only research firm in the world that takes a look at the open source market. I will take you over now to the first slide. Let me tell you something about what's going on in the open source market. Thank you. Open source has been around for a handful of years, available as free software that could be downloaded by everybody who's on this call. Already knows that. But what we have found is we've found that growth of open source downloads, which is significant in terms of measuring how much is really out there in a production environment, what we have found is that from June of 2006 to June of 2008, just a 2-year period of time, the growth of downloads increased by 600%. There are now about 6,000 open source downloads every day. And while they don't all end up in a production environment, a very large number of them do. And so therefore, as you're monitoring what happens in the marketplace, the 600% growth is quite important. New system growth from 2007 to 2008, 40%. Why is the 40% relevant? If you take a look at the proprietary PBX marketplace, into which we cluster companies such as Avaya, former Nortel, Cisco, Toshiba, Panasonic, I could go on and on. That market from 2007 to 2008 barely changed at all, and if it did anything, it changed a point up or a point down, not 40% up. When we take a look at the first half of 2009, true, some conventional or proprietary PBX manufacturers had some growth in the beginning of 2009, just as we found that other proprietary manufacturers had difficulties in the first half of 2009. Net effect, the market marginally changed at all for proprietary. But take a look at this slide. You see that open source in the first half of 2009 changed by 30%. Now, we'll take a look at the next slide now. The size of the market is open source, and this is a North American number I'm going to give you, but North America is about 28% of worldwide for 2008. We're not releasing 2009 data because first what we have to do is get to the end of the year. But the market for open source in 2008 was $1.2 billion in North America. The number of new lines or endpoints sold is 2.9 million. These are in a production environment, which means that if the cost, let's say, of a traditional PBX line is $100 or $800 per PBX line that the end user is paying for that, then each one of those lines that goes to open source represents $600 or $800 that does not go into the revenue stream that accrues to manufacturers of PBX systems. Open source PBX, this is in the 30 years that I have run Eastern Management Group, this is the most controversial number that we have ever placed into the market because some people will say, we don't think the market for open source is as large, but no one has taken a look that we've ever been able to find and say we have actually gone and taken a look at the market and we know what it is. The 18%, based on our 25 years of experience, is a number we are extremely comfortable with, and we've done exhaustive analysis and exhaustive modeling and research in order to come up with that. Let's take a look at the next slide now. $1.2 billion. Where does that all come or go? If you say, well, open source is free and it's not free. True, I can download open source. I do download open source, and I download upgrades to open source software as well, and it doesn't cost me anything to do that. However, there is more to open source than that. If I want to, for example, get an open source distribution, I may have to pay for the open source distribution. SIP phones carry a cost. Gateways, GUIs, distributions. You can see down the list, firewalls, PBX appliances. Xorcom makes a PBX appliance. So someone doesn't have to download their own software. They don't have to acquire gateways. They don't have to deal with distributions, firewalls, things along those lines. That PBX appliance business, many of you would think of PBX appliances as, oh, I know SwitchFox. They're in the PBX appliance business. True. And in fact, they're the largest in the PBX appliance business. But there are other companies that play in the PBX appliance space. And so there's revenue every time someone buys a PBX appliance. They're paying money for that, and that's also part of the $1.2 billion market. And SIP trunking as well, but SIP trunks themselves are not counted in the $1.2 billion. Let's take a look at the next slide. Here's why open source is growing. When we have interviewed companies, our first study, over 7,000 companies we talked to. Our second study, much smaller in size. Our third study, 5,000. We always come up with the same answer. People put in open source PBX because it is less expensive. Anecdotally, I'll tell you, I sat on the boards of 3 different companies, and at a point in time, each of those companies wanted to install a PBX. They came to me. I was a board member. And they said, look, you know a lot about the PBX industry. You've been in this thing since graduating from college. Tell us what PBX we should put in. And I did. I told all 3 of them the same proprietary PBX manufacturer that I had a lot of confidence in. And I found out 12 months later, when I went back to the tick test and see what's going on, none of those 3 companies had put in anything that I had recommended. It doesn't say a lot about their perception of me as a board member or my ability to pick a right technology. But what they had done is they had all put in open source. That is really what caused us to begin to take a serious look at this. But take a look at this. This is open source, $400 to $600 per line installed by the time You include the SIP phones and the gateways and distributions and the like. Proprietary PBX is $700 to $1,000 per line. And so what you have is this massive disparity that causes people to opt for open source. Take a look at the next slide. This is part of the great interest in open source, and also part of the great misconception people have when they don't know very much about open source or they're standing on the outside and they're a proprietary PBX manufacturer. Look at this. The average customer who puts in open source is an enterprise with 15 corporate locations. That does not mean that every single location is connected by open source, but it means that each of these companies, on average, has 15 business locations. I would say that that classifies them as enterprise on average. People sometimes say that open source is just tech companies, right? It's tech geeks that download this stuff, place it in their basement, and that's the end of it. That's not true. We monitor 22 industries. Actually, we take the whole world and we compress the world into 22 different industries. And what we find is we find examples of open source, measurable examples of open source based on now about 15,000 interviews, completed interviews, and we find open source in all 22 of the industries. Non-tech companies comprise 40% of the users of open source. We find open source in government, about 4% of open source goes into government installations. We find it in banks, hospitals, universities, right down the line, measurable percentages of open source. One of the 22 industries we check is mining. We even found a measurable percentage of open source in the mining sector. Second installation size. What does this mean? People who put in open source don't put in one system and then decide, this just didn't work out well, I'm not going to do it again. In fact, what happens is they put in open source and they find that it does work. And then they install a second installation at a different location, of course. Now, let's talk about a distinction between first installations and second installations. A great misunderstanding about open source is that, okay, people will say, if there is open source out there, and let's accept that there is open source working in a production environment, then they're all small systems. Well, that's not true. And so you need to understand the distinction between first installation and second installation. First installation, when people put in open source, it's generally a very small installation. First one in a production environment tends to be quite small. Companies put it in, an IT manager puts it in, or a bar puts it in to a branch office of a company perhaps, and they want to start small because of a anxiety. If it doesn't work, they want death with dignity. They don't want to go and have the first test system out there at 1,000 stations. So the first systems tend to be very small, about 25 extensions, endpoint size, parent stations. So those are quite small. The second installation is about 64 endpoints. Now at 64 endpoints, if you say, well, on a proprietary PBX, that would be $1,000 an endpoint, $64,000 sale. Those second installations, therefore, are quite large. While 64 is still lower than the size of the average proprietary PBX installation for the world at large. For open source, 64 is a very, very large number, and it creeps up. That's just the second installation size. PBX appliances is a market accelerator because PBX appliances, right from the first installation of the PBX. I don't know what Xorcom's situation is. I don't know what Ditium's situation is in terms of the size of their PBX appliances when they put them in. But what we do know is that when companies put in a PBX appliance as the very first installation, it tends to be much larger than the average open source installation, PBX appliances. And these systems, on average, are about 64 station lines as well. Let's take a look at the next slide. I'm sorry, I said 64. It's 54. But still, take a look at the average open source system for the world at large. 34 stations, there's installations closer to 25. The world at large average among first installs and nth installs, 34, and take a look at the PBX appliances, 54. PBX appliances for open source we think are very, very important because consider open source from the perspective of the enterprise or the SMB. Open source is very simple to install. We played a very large role in the installation of our own first proprietary open source system. We could have done it ourselves. But the SMB oftentimes does not want to roll up their shirt sleeves and get involved in the installation. Therefore, PBX appliances, whoever you get them from, PBX appliances are a great way to go. We think ultimately that the growth of open source will be measured more by the success of the growth of PBX appliances than anything else. Why? Because you turn to a company, you buy a PBX, you get it from a bar, you buy it from a Dell computer, you get it into your office, you have someone install it, whether it's your own IT person, or you bring in an installer, or the reseller that you acquire it from has that product. You put it into your space, and then all the fuss and muss is gone, and there's nothing else to worry about. Let's take a look at the next slide. Open source this year is growing, and I mentioned that there's 30% growth. But take a look at how open source grew over the first half of 08 and how it grew over the second half of 08 as we look at the first 6 months of 2009. First 6 months of 2009, 30% growth of open source over the first half of 08, and then 38% growth over the second half. Let's turn the slide down. The situation regarding a conflict between open source and proprietary PBXs is worth noting. This, I think, is very significant. I had dinner with the CEO of a proprietary PBX manufacturer some time ago, and when I told him that open source was 18% of the market, he said, "Well, we really don't see it in the marketplace." And that's a common comment from people who are in the PBX industry, at least when they talk to me. They say, we don't see it in the marketplace. We think only technology companies use open source. I addressed that a little bit ago. The commercial implementations are small, right? And when I said the average installation is 34, his comment was, yeah, that's what I mean. They're really small, and we're a PBX manufacturer. So their thoughts are the commercial implementations are small. However, that does not mean that you won't find open source systems out in the marketplace of 500, 1,000, 2,000 endpoints. Take a look. The one that people talk about very, very frequently is Amazon.com, a remarkably large installation measured in the thousands of endpoints. Amazon.com is not anomalous. There are a lot of Amazon.coms out there, household names that have massive implementations. So to say that the commercial implementations are strong is erroneous. Most deployments are not in a production environment. Untrue. Companies put in open source initially in a test environment, find that it works, and then they're out of there. And then they put it into a production environment. A manufacturer of a PBX appliance said to me that what they like about working with Pure Asterisk, which is at the heart of the PBX appliance that they have, he said, what I like is this stuff is very stable. It works. It doesn't break. And when people get it, they don't have to keep rolling trucks to keep it maintained. They don't have to keep paying for maintenance programs all the time because this stuff just works. And so companies put it into a test environment initially, roll it out into production. Infrequently then do they ever go and put in more tests, and they continue to expand the production. Not a serious PBX competitor, I hear. Absolutely untrue. I was talking to someone yesterday at a proprietary PBX manufacturer. He said the market was really crummy this year for us, but it's the economy. And I said open source is 18% of the market. If open source did not exist, what we would find is that the aggregate of PBX manufacturers would have found a rising of the tide of 18%. Don't misconstrue. Open source didn't get 18% overnight. This just didn't happen in 2008 from nothing. Right? Open source was eating into the PBX market in 2008, 2007, 2006. It has been slow in its growing, even though it's been a remarkable growth, but it started from somewhere and it has been nipping away at the PBX industry. So that's my comment about this fellow who said, bad economy, bad year for us. And I said, what do you do when the economy improves next year, in 2011, in 2012, in 2013? If our market is flat, now what do you do? Because open source at that point is not going to be 18% of the market. It's going to be larger in the marketplace. Open source is not worth the risk. Very last comment on this page. I spoke to someone recently, and I agree with this comment. He said, if I buy a PBX from a proprietary PBX manufacturer, he's got 30 engineers, 50 engineers, 100 engineers, 300 engineers working on staff. You pick the number, and I'll tell you that when I work with a piece of Asterisk software, and Asterisk is only one of a couple of different kinds of implementations, but happen to be the largest, far and away, with 80-some-odd% of the market. You've got thousands, this was this comment, you have thousands of engineers that are working on this. And there isn't a risk, and I agree. Let's take a look at the next slide. This is real interesting. This is what I call the battlefield slide. You can find some information related to this in an article we published in No Jitter just a couple of weeks ago. And it goes on for about 1,500 words on this particular slide. But this is really interesting. We took a look recently at a study. This is a study we did in October. And we asked 5,000 companies, how many open source PBXs do you have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up through N. And we chose to take a look at those who said they have 2. Why is 2 important? 2 is important because these are people who put in open source the first time and decided they're going to do it again. We asked those people, before you put in your second open source, did you look at competing solutions from proprietary manufacturers? 51% said yes, they did. The average size system that they installed, 147 lines. Why is 147 material? It's almost 50% larger than the average proprietary PBX sold today. The value of a 147-line system to a proprietary PBX manufacturer is about $117,000. Which means that every one of these systems that goes is $117,000 that a proprietary PBX manufacturer doesn't have. And why aren't they getting it? Because those customers are saving an average of $44,000 by putting in open source. Take a look at the next slide. The next slide is also one of the most fascinating slides we've ever done. Because I had heard from a couple of proprietary manufacturers that they really don't run into open source in the marketplace. What I decided to do is when we talked to 5,000 companies that put in open source and then said that they had gone of those 51% that had looked at proprietary, we wanted to find out, well, which proprietary PBXs did you seriously consider? They considered an average of 2.24 proprietary PBXs, and you can see on the chart right here in front of you just who they looked at. In every single one of those cases, the companies you're looking at the chart lost to open source in what I would consider to be active competition. Let's take a look at the next chart. This will be the last chart I'm going to show you. You're going to really wonder what all bars are down at the bottom that I haven't filled in. All I'm going to tell you is what they point to, and I won't give you the answer. But what we wanted to find out in our last study is we wanted to look at companies who have never put in open source. Never. Not in test, not in production, nothing. These are the non-believers, I would like to think. And we said to them, for the last PBX that you put in, what proprietary PBXs or non-proprietary did you look at? And every one of those bars along the bottom is, in fact, a company whose name you saw on the chart just before. It just is that I can't tell you right now because we're publishing it in an article. I can't tell you which company is associated with which bar. But all of these companies were evaluated by an IT manager who chose a proprietary PBX and walked away from open source, right? And a proprietary PBX manufacturer to say yay. But when you take a look at the largest bar is the most fascinating because it says that of companies that never put open source in their lives, the company that they looked at most before they chose to put in proprietary was open source. What this says to me is this says that we've got something massive going on. In early years, I've taken a look at the PBX industry. This is the most profound change that I have ever seen. And I've been around since analog went to digital, since digital went to IP. And what's interesting, in each case, the same manufacturers could say, well, we were in analog and we converted to digital. And those manufacturers say, and then we converted to IP. What's happening now is as people move to open source, there's this stepping off of a cliff because the proprietary manufacturers are not in the open source area. And I'll just conclude by saying open source is not open standards. This is very different. Just turn to the next page. So at this point, what I'll do, I welcome people to get in touch with me. My email address is there. Send me an email, ask questions, things like that. You can learn about what Eastern Management does in open source by taking a look at our website, fill out a form, send it to us, and we'll be happy to talk with you or contact us at one of the phone numbers. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Xorcom.
Thank you very much, John. That was very informative and oftentimes surprising. And we're going to continue now with the second portion of the webinar. And this is along the same lines. We're just looking at open source purchasing trends from the viewpoint of a manufacturer, and that would be us, Xorcom. So we'll start with just a few words about introduction to our company, and then we'll look at market trends that we've seen. Who were the early adopters, the evolution of the customers that we're coming into contact with, and the current feedback that we get from the market. And if we have time, we'd like to go into what we call the 5 R's, because one of the concerns that we hear in the current feedback is when customers are comparing the solutions, of course, they're looking at the price tag, but they're also looking at reliability. Xorcom was established in 2004, and our sole occupation here is to manufacture asterisk-based telephony solutions. We have developed something called XPP technology, which basically says that we use USB 2 connectivity in all of our solutions. We have 3 different families of IP-PBX. Those are standalone appliances, each one geared for a different size customer. And we also have a USB-connected channel bank. It did win the award at the last IT Expo for Best Open Source Solution. We build reliability into our products using TwinStar, which is a failover solution, Rapid Recovery, which is a backup and restore device, and Live Rescue, which is a temporary bootable disk on key. Our drivers have been a standard component in Asterisk since February of 2006, which in our mind just drives home the point that this is an active community. People that work in the Asterisk world depend on the software. There's a lot of sharing, a lot of cooperation going on amongst all of the members, and this what keeps the products really ahead of their time. A few words about this XPP technology. No longer need the PRI to connect to channel banks or extend your Asterisk system. If you'll take a look at the bottom of the slide, you'll see our hardware design where you have an external unit which provides the telephony interfaces. All of our devices are flexible and scalable. You can accommodate up to 32 FXO or FXS ports within a single chassis, and that can be a mix, also digital, BRI, E1, T1, etc. Let's take a look at the trends now. John's group, the Eastern Management Group, did publish in July of 2009 a report which basically put 2 main factors as the impetus for adopting open source. One was the minimal amount of capital needed to purchase such an appliance or solution, and the high amount of flexibility that you have with open source as far as integrating other applications. As John mentioned, open source PBXs typically cost approximately 40% less than conventional systems. And then, as I said, the simplicity with which you can integrate other software applications. These we also noticed as main drivers for early adopters. Who were those early adopters? Definitely the smaller businesses and what I call the open source freaks, people that were always, on the edge looking for new technologies and contributors to the open source programs. A little down the line, there was definitely the industry buzz, which got things going. Mark Spencer, the original developer, the main guy as far as Asterisk is concerned, made the cover of Vaughan in December of 2005, brought a lot of look into this as a possible platform for telephony. And as the Eastern Management Group reported, 18% of the 2008 installs in North America were indeed based on open source solutions. So at this point, we're already getting input from end users actively seeking asterisk-based solutions or open source solutions. So it's being driven also not only from the developers and the fringe or even the companies looking for lower cost solutions, but end users from all types of vertical markets are pushing the channel, the reseller distribution market to provide them with open source based solutions. I brought a quote that I found very interesting from Mark Spencer talking about disruptive technologies. Now, he was talking about cell phones here. Basically, what he said was the best thing to happen to the emergence of voice over IP because it lowered the bar for voice quality and allowed VoIP to be tolerated as it entered the market. He said this is a great demonstration of disruptive technology because Asterisk wasn't better than a hardware phone switched with copper. They were just an interesting high-value alternative. Again, this is an indication of one of the early drivers, okay? I think everybody remembers how cell phones hit the market, and we all did put up with the degradation of quality because of the mobility that it enabled. And just like with voice over IP, there were some hurdles as far as the quality and the reliability. But what can I say? We are definitely past that now. We are in the next phase. Today, top quality is required. Open source is mainstream. And as John pointed out in his surveys, companies are judging open source as they are judging the conventional proprietary systems. It's all on an even playing field. Just a few bits of information from our customer base. We notice that with contact centers, we're having a lot of pull. As you know, contact centers have, their whole business is based on telephone communication. And of course, a contact center, better than most, knows that integrating the data network with the telephony network is a must, and that makes their business very efficient. So when you have companies that go and choose open source solutions in contact centers, you can be very well assured that the quality is there. We're noticing a lot of activity amongst the government agencies, and this is from the United States through Latin America, through the APAC countries. So it's really a worldwide phenomenon that open source is being openly sought after and included in the tenders. Another interesting vertical market is hospitality and tourism. On the hotels, for example, the existing infrastructure with all of those FXS lines, it's a sure bet for anybody promoting open source because it's a great way to take advantage of existing equipment and bring them up to the level of all that voice over IP and the integrated network has to offer. And like I said before, we do get a lot of questions about the reliability of open source. So at Xorcom, we have been putting a lot of effort into building reliability into our product line. When you look at legacy switches, which are under the care and nurturing of a single company, as opposed to anybody that can take an Asterisk distribution and download it onto their PC and say, hey, now I have, a telephony system, you see that we're dealing with very different commodities here. So how do we build in high availability? We call it approaching the 5 nines, which is the kind of uptime that we're looking for in corporate telephony, with 5 R's. Each one of these R's is a utility that helps to guarantee peace of mind. The first R is a utility that allows replication and restoration of the PBX. Another R is a rescue utility. We'll go into these in the next slides. RAID 1, which is a dual hard drive for redundancy. Rapid tunneling is a way to provide remote service. And redundancy, that's our failover solution, providing a redundant server and an intelligent failover mechanism. For the replicate and restore, we have a simple USB disk-on key. I know it looks like a credit card, but it contains a utility which allows you to back up the entire PBX, and that including the distribution and any kind of voice prompts on this USB disk-on key. And then using the same utility, you can restore the PBX at any time. So it's very, very quick and convenient. The rescue utility, I liken it to changing off a tire if you're on the roadway and you get a flat. You pull out just a temporary solution from your trunk. It's usually that tiny little tire. It'll get you to the nearest service station, but not much farther. Again, this utility is based on USB technology. You can run your Asterisk server directly from this bootable disk-on key. It's called the Live Rescue. The RAID support, as I mentioned before, is the idea that you have a dual hard drive and everything is replicated immediately so that if any problem is experienced in one of the drives, the other drive takes over and the PBX continues to run without a hitch. And at the same time, a message is sent to the system administrator, and that also guarantees maximum uptime. The rapid tunneling utility allows the service personnel to tunnel into the PBX and to perform diagnostics, troubleshooting, and even correct any kind of configuration issues. And so that's also very important to the customers. On the redundancy side, this application that I'm going to describe for you is the TwinStar, which was introduced at the IT Expo last year. It's basically made up of 2 identical servers and a channel bank. And as I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, our channel bank it's external to the servers, and all of the telephony interfaces are located in this unit. Each of the servers is connected via USB 2, and you have your analog phone connections as well as your IP phones. Now you'll notice that the IP phones are connected to both servers. You need a unique IP address, but we have a method for ghosting the IP address on the backup server, and that will come into play later. Under standard operation, the primary server is active and all of the telephony goes through it. And the mechanism in the Astor Bank is constantly monitoring to make sure. You can see in this little blow up on your screen that the Astor Bank does have dual USB ports so that USB connection can be established with each one of the servers. Now, in the event that the primary server fails, the mechanism within the Astor Bank detects this immediately and switches all of the telephony to the backup server, reestablishing the connection and dial tone to the analog phones, pulling to the foreground the ghosted primary server IP address for the backup server, and so all the SIP phones are automatically re-registered on the network. So again, those 5 R's, the replicate and restoration utility, the rescue for running the PBX off the USB port, RAID 1 for dual hard drive redundancy, rapid tunneling for quick and targeted service, and TwinStar for redundancy. We do appreciate you taking the time to listen to us and participate today. And I look forward to hearing from all of you suggestions for future webinars. And feel free, of course, to visit our website, register for our newsletter so that you'll always be on top of what's happening at Xorcom. Thanks. Bye.